We begin with a question that I think many of you have probably asked yourselves at some point, especially if you've been paying close attention to your health after 50, 60, or beyond. What if one of the most important things you could do for your blood pressure didn't happen in the morning, didn't happen in the doctor's office, and didn't involve reaching for another pill? What if it happened in the quiet hours of the evening, in the calm before sleep, with something so simple, so ordinary, that you've probably had it sitting in your kitchen for years without ever realizing its potential? This is the idea I want to explore with you today. And I want to start by acknowledging something that might feel a little uncomfortable. When we talk about blood pressure, especially as we get older, the conversation almost always revolves around what we do during the day. We talk about morning medications, about cutting back on salt, about stress management during working hours. And all of that matters. It matters deeply. But there's a whole chapter of this story that happens while we're sleeping, a chapter that most of us never think to write. I'm Dr. Nargis, and on this channel, we take the time to look at health differently. Not with urgency or alarm, but with curiosity. Because the truth is, some of the most powerful insights into our long-term well-being come not from dramatic interventions, but from understanding the subtle rhythms of our own bodies. And today, we're going to talk about one of those rhythms. One that plays out every single night, often without us realizing it, and one that can be gently supported by something as simple as a drink before bed. Now, before we go any further, I want to be very clear about something. I am a cardiologist, and I have spent decades helping patients manage their blood pressure. I have seen the frustration when numbers don't budge despite doing everything right, and I have also seen the quiet relief when a small, thoughtful adjustment makes a noticeable difference. But nothing I share today is meant to replace the advice of your own physician, nor is it a guarantee. What I want to offer is a way of thinking about your health that opens up new possibilities that are grounded in physiology, in the way your body actually works when you're not paying attention. So let's start with a picture. Imagine your day. You wake up, maybe you take your blood pressure medication if it's been prescribed. You go about your morning, you watch what you eat, you try to stay active. And by the time evening comes, you feel like you've done your part. You settle in, maybe you have a glass of water, maybe some tea, and then you go to sleep, assuming that your body is simply resting, simply maintaining what you've built during the day. But here's what I want you to consider. Your body is not a machine that you set in the morning and then leave to run on its own. Your body is a living system, and it follows rhythms that are ancient, rhythms that predate modern medicine, rhythms that are intimately connected to the cycle of light and dark, wakefulness and sleep. And one of the most important of these rhythms, especially when it comes to your blood pressure, happens in the hours after you close your eyes. During the day, your blood pressure naturally fluctuates based on what you're doing, how you're feeling, what you're eating. But at night, in a healthy system, something remarkable occurs. Your blood pressure is supposed to dip. It's supposed to fall by about 10 to 20% compared to your daytime average. This nocturnal dip is not just a random occurrence. It is a critical period of rest for your cardiovascular system, a time when your blood vessels relax, when your heart rate slows, when your body literally gives your arteries a break from the constant pressure of the day. And here's the part that most people don't know. When that nighttime dip doesn't happen, when blood pressure stays elevated through the night, it places a persistent, unrelenting strain on the vascular system. And over time, that pattern is associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular events, including heart attack and stroke, independent of what your daytime blood pressure readings might show. In other words, what happens while you're sleeping matters just as much, sometimes more, than what happens while you're awake. So now we arrive at the central question of our time together. If this nighttime dip is so important, what can we do to support it? And more specifically, is there something simple, something we can incorporate into our evening routine that might help encourage that natural nocturnal dip to occur more reliably? This is where the idea of a simple drink before bed enters the picture. And I know what some of you might be thinking. Another health trend. Another thing to add to the list. But I want to pause here and ask you to stay with me, because what we're going to uncover over the next several minutes is not a trend. It's not a fad. It's a physiological principle that has been observed in medical literature, that has shown up in studies, and that has quietly been part of traditional practices for generations. The drink itself is not the hero of this story. The hero is understanding why it works, what it does in your body, and how timing, that crucial element of when you consume something, can turn an ordinary beverage into a gentle, supportive signal for your cardiovascular system. Now, I realize that I've been circling around this idea, and you're probably wondering exactly what drink I'm referring to. And I'm going to tell you. But I want to do something first. I want to give you the context that makes this information useful. Because if I simply said, drink this before bed and your blood pressure will improve, I wouldn't be doing my job as a physician. That's not how medicine works. That's not how your body works. Instead, I want to walk you through the mechanism. I want to show you why this particular beverage, when consumed at the right time, can have an effect that goes beyond simple hydration. I want to show you what's actually happening in your blood vessels, in your nervous system, and in the hormonal signals that govern your sleep and your cardiovascular function. And I want to do it in a way that leaves you not just with a tip, but with a genuine understanding that you can carry with you, that you can discuss with your own doctor, that you can adapt to your own life. So by the end of this video, you're going to understand not just what to consider adding to your evening routine, but why it matters. You're going to understand the connection between sleep, the nervous system, and blood pressure regulation. And you're going to walk away with a clearer sense of how small, thoughtful choices made at the right time can support your body's natural rhythms in ways that feel less like effort and more like alignment. Let's begin by talking about what actually happens when your blood pressure stays high at night, and why so many people, despite doing everything right during the day, never realize that their evenings hold the key to better numbers by morning. Let's talk about what most people get wrong when it comes to blood pressure management. And I want to be careful here, because when I say wrong, I don't mean careless or uninformed. I mean something more subtle. I mean that the way we've been taught to think about blood pressure, the way it's often discussed in quick office visits and brief conversations, leaves out a critical piece of the puzzle. And that missing piece is time. When we think about blood pressure, we tend to think in snapshots. A number in the morning, a number before dinner, a number at the doctor's office. These snapshots become our reference points, our targets, and certainly tracking blood pressure is important. But the snapshot approach creates an illusion. It creates the impression that blood pressure is a static thing, a fixed number that we either have under control or we don't. And that illusion leads to a very common misunderstanding. Many people believe that if their blood pressure readings during the day are acceptable, if they're taking their medication consistently and seeing numbers that their doctor is comfortable with, then everything is fine. They assume that the work is done. They assume that nighttime, because they're resting, because they're asleep, is simply a continuation of that controlled state. But the reality is far more complex and in some ways far more interesting. Here's what actually happens in the body over a 24-hour period. Blood pressure is not a flat line. It's a wave. It rises in the early morning hours as your body prepares to wake, a phenomenon sometimes called the morning surge. It fluctuates throughout the day based on activity, stress, meals, and even the position of your body. And then in a healthy cardiovascular system, it falls during sleep. That fall, that nocturnal dip, is not accidental. It is an active process, orchestrated by your nervous system, by hormones, by the intricate communication between your brain and your blood vessels. Now here's where the misunderstanding takes root. Many people, including some who are very diligent about their health, assume that if their daytime blood pressure is well managed, their nighttime blood pressure will automatically follow suit. They assume that the medications they take in the morning, the lifestyle habits they maintain during the day, will carry over into the night, and sometimes they do. but sometimes they don't. And that gap, that disconnect between daytime control and nighttime reality, is one of the most overlooked areas in blood pressure management. I've seen this countless times in my practice. A patient comes in, they show me their blood pressure log, and the numbers look good. Morning readings are in a healthy range. Afternoon readings are stable. They're taking their medication as prescribed. They're watching their salt. They're doing everything they've been told to do. And yet, when we dig a little deeper, when we look at what's happening while they sleep, we find that their blood pressure isn't dipping. It's staying elevated, sometimes significantly, through the night. This pattern, what's called non-dipping blood pressure, is more common than most people realize. And here's the part that matters. Studies have shown that individuals whose blood pressure fails to dip at night have a higher risk of cardiovascular events, even when their daytime blood pressure appears to be well controlled. In other words, you can do everything right during the day and still miss a critical window of cardiovascular protection simply because the tools you're using, the strategies you're relying on, weren't designed to address what happens after you close your eyes. So why does this happen? Why would blood pressure stay elevated at night when the body is supposed to be resting? The answer lies in the autonomic nervous system, the part of your nervous system that operates below the level of conscious control. This system has two main branches: the sympathetic nervous system, often called the fight or flight response, which raises heart rate and constricts blood vessels, and the parasympathetic nervous system, often called the rest and digest response, which slows heart rate and allows blood vessels to relax. During the day, especially in our modern world, many of us live with a sympathetic nervous system that is constantly activated. We're stressed, we're busy, we're rushing. And that's understandable. But at night, when we sleep, the parasympathetic nervous system is supposed to take over. It's supposed to signal to the blood vessels that it's time to relax, to widen, to allow pressure to drop. This is the mechanism behind the nocturnal dip. But here's what can happen. For some people, the parasympathetic signal is weak. For others, the sympathetic system remains active, even during sleep. And when that happens, the blood vessels don't fully relax. The pressure stays higher than it should. The cardiovascular system doesn't get the break it needs. And over time, this pattern takes a toll. Now let's connect this back to the idea of a simple drink before bed. Because what I want you to understand is that the drink itself, whatever it ends up being, is not a medication. It's not a direct vasodilator in the way that a prescription drug might be. Instead, what we're talking about is something much more elegant. We're talking about supporting the body's own parasympathetic nervous system. We're talking about giving the body a gentle signal at the right time that encourages it to shift into that restful state, to allow the blood vessels to relax, to permit that natural dip to occur. And this is where timing becomes everything. If you consume something during the day, the effects are mediated by your daytime physiology. Your body is active, your metabolism is high, your nervous system is in a different state. But if you consume something in the evening, in the hour or so before sleep, you're introducing it at a time when your body is naturally beginning to transition. You're working with the rhythm, not against it. This is also why the common belief that hydration alone is enough, that simply drinking water before bed will support blood pressure, misses the mark. Hydration is important, but what we're talking about here is not just hydration. It's about providing specific compounds that interact with the nervous system, that support nitric oxide production in the blood vessels, that help quiet the sympathetic tone that might otherwise persist into the night. So the overlooked problem, the thing that so many people never consider, is this. Blood pressure management is not just about lowering numbers during the day. It's about restoring the natural rhythm of the cardiovascular system, the rise and fall, the daytime activity, and the nighttime rest. And when that rhythm is disrupted, when the nighttime dip is absent or blunted, the body misses a critical period of recovery. That disruption is not always reflected in your daytime readings. You can have perfectly acceptable numbers during the day and still be carrying a cardiovascular risk that you don't even know exists. This is why, when I work with patients, I encourage them to think about blood pressure differently, not as a single number to be lowered, but as a pattern to be understood. And once you understand the pattern, once you see the importance of that nighttime dip, the question becomes very practical. What can you do in the quiet hours of the evening to support your body's natural tendency to rest, to relax, to allow those blood vessels to open up and let the pressure fall? And that question leads us to a real-world example. Because understanding the physiology is one thing, but seeing how this plays out in an actual person's life in the context of daily routines and evening habits, that's where the insight becomes tangible. That's what we're going to explore next. Let me tell you about a patient I'll call Richard. And I want to be clear from the start that Richard is not one person, but rather a composite, a collection of experiences I've had over the years with people who came to my office feeling frustrated, confused, and sometimes a little defeated. Because Richard's story, in its essence, is one that I've seen play out again and again. And I suspect some of you listening right now might recognize pieces of it in your own experience. Richard was 63 when he first came to see me. He was retired from a career in construction management, a man who had spent his life solving problems, meeting deadlines, getting things done. And when it came to his health, he approached it the same way. He was disciplined. He took his blood pressure medication every morning without fail. He had cut back on salt years ago after his doctor first mentioned his numbers were creeping up. He walked 3 miles most days, sometimes 4 if the weather was good. And yet, when he sat down in my office, there was a weariness in his expression that went beyond his age. He pulled out a blood pressure log, the kind with columns and dates and meticulous notes, and he showed it to me. Morning readings, 132/84. Afternoon readings, 128/80. Occasional evening readings, 135/86. He pointed at the numbers with his finger, tapping each one as if to say, "Look, I'm doing everything right." And his numbers on paper looked good. They looked controlled. His primary care physician had told him as much. But Richard had a problem. He didn't feel well. He woke up most mornings with a dull headache behind his eyes. He felt sluggish, heavy, as if the rest he was supposed to be getting during the night had somehow eluded him. And every so often, at his routine checkups, his doctor would mention that his blood pressure seemed a little variable, a little unpredictable, without any clear reason why. Richard was a man who liked answers. He wanted to understand. So he came to see me, not because his numbers were alarming, but because something didn't add up. And in my experience, that kind of instinct, that quiet sense that something is off, even when the data looks acceptable, is often the first clue that we need to look deeper. I asked Richard if he had ever had his blood pressure monitored overnight. He hadn't. Most people haven't. And that's not because it's a complicated test. Ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, where you wear a small device that takes readings every 20 to 30 minutes over a 24-hour period, is a tool that has been available for decades. But it's not something that gets ordered routinely, especially when daytime readings appear to be under control. So we scheduled one. The results came back, and they told a story that Richard's morning log had completely missed. During the day, his blood pressure was indeed well controlled, sometimes even better than his home readings suggested. But at night, something different was happening. Instead of the healthy 10 to 20% dip that his cardiovascular system needed, his blood pressure barely budged. It hovered in the same range throughout the night, sometimes even rising slightly during the early morning hours. He was what we call a non-dipper, and in fact, there were periods where his pattern veered into what's known as reverse dipping, where nighttime pressures were actually higher than his daytime averages. Now, when I shared this with Richard, I could see the relief on his face. Not because the news was good, but because there was finally an explanation. The headaches in the morning, the sluggishness, the sense that something was off despite doing everything right, it all began to make sense. His blood vessels weren't getting the rest they needed at night. His cardiovascular system was essentially working around the clock, without that critical period of relaxation that allows the arteries to recover from the constant pressure of the day. But then came the question that Richard asked, and it's the same question that so many of you might be asking right now. What do I do about it? I'm already taking my medication. I'm already watching my diet. I'm already exercising. What else is there? And this is where the conversation shifted, because Richard had been doing everything right according to the conventional playbook. But the conventional playbook, as I mentioned earlier, is built around daytime management. It's built around the assumption that if you control blood pressure during the hours you're awake, the nighttime will take care of itself. For some people, that's true. For many, it's not. And Richard was one of those people. So we began to look at his evening routine, and what I found was something that I've seen in countless patients. Richard's evenings were what you might call neutral. He wasn't doing anything harmful, but he also wasn't doing anything intentionally supportive. He would have dinner around 6, usually a sensible meal that he and his wife prepared together. He would watch the evening news, maybe read a little, and then around 9:30, he would have a glass of water before heading to bed. There was nothing wrong with any of this, but there was also nothing that was actively signaling to his nervous system that it was time to shift from daytime activity to nighttime restoration. And here's where the story takes a turn that I think is worth paying attention to. I suggested to Richard that we try something simple. Not a new medication, not a dramatic change to his diet, not an elaborate evening ritual that would require hours of preparation. Just one small addition to his evening routine, a specific drink consumed about an hour before bed, chosen not for any miraculous property, but because of what we know about how certain natural compounds interact with the nervous system and the blood vessels. I asked him to keep everything else exactly the same. Same medication in the morning, same walking routine, same sensible dinners. Just add this one thing and see what happens. Richard, being the meticulous person he was, agreed. And over the next several weeks, he continued to take his morning readings, but this time he also paid attention to how he felt when he woke up. The headaches, he told me, began to ease. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The sluggishness started to lift, and when we repeated the ambulatory monitoring after 8 weeks, the numbers told the rest of the story. His blood pressure during the day remained well controlled, but now, for the first time in years, he was showing a clear nocturnal dip. Not a dramatic one, but a meaningful one. Enough that his cardiovascular system was finally getting the nightly rest it had been missing. Now, I want to be very careful here. Richard's story is not a prescription. It's not a guarantee. What worked for him, in his body, with his particular pattern of non-dipping blood pressure, may not apply exactly to someone else. But what his story illustrates is something much more universal. It illustrates that the gap between daytime control and nighttime reality is real, that it affects more people than we realize, and that sometimes the solution lies not in doing more, but in doing one small thing at the right time. Richard's experience also highlights something else that I think is worth pausing on. He had been doing everything right, by the book, for years. And yet, there was this hidden layer of his health that had gone unaddressed simply because no one had ever looked. No one had ever asked about his evening routine. No one had ever considered that the timing of certain habits might matter as much as the habits themselves. This is not a failure on anyone's part. It's simply a reflection of how medicine has traditionally been practiced, focused on daytime metrics, daytime interventions, daytime solutions. But our bodies don't operate on a 9-to-5 schedule. They operate on a 24-hour cycle, one that has been shaped by millions of years of evolution, one that expects certain things to happen at certain times. And when we align our habits with that rhythm, when we give our bodies what they need when they need it, we open the door to a kind of support that no pill can fully replicate. So now we arrive at the question that Richard's story naturally raises. What was that drink? What was the simple addition that helped support his body's natural nighttime dip? And more importantly, What is the mechanism behind it? How does something as ordinary as a beverage, consumed at the right time, interact with the nervous system, the blood vessels, and the delicate balance that determines whether your blood pressure falls or stays elevated while you sleep? To answer that, we need to step into the physiology. We need to understand what's actually happening in the body when that nighttime dip occurs, what can disrupt it, and how certain natural compounds can gently encourage it. And that's exactly where we're going next. To understand what was happening in Richard's body, and to understand what that simple evening drink was actually doing, we need to step into the physiology of the night. And I want to invite you to imagine this not as a complicated medical lecture, but as a quiet observation of your own body at rest. Because what happens inside you while you sleep is one of the most elegant, carefully orchestrated processes in human biology. And when we understand it, the choices we make in the evening take on a new kind of meaning. Let's start with the blood vessel itself. Your arteries are not rigid pipes. They are living, dynamic structures lined with a thin layer of cells called the endothelium. This endothelium is not just a passive lining. It is an active organ, one that produces a remarkable molecule called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is the signal that tells your blood vessels to relax, to widen, to allow blood to flow with less resistance. When your endothelium is healthy and producing adequate nitric oxide, your blood vessels have the flexibility they need to respond to the changing demands of your body. When you're active during the day, they can constrict appropriately to maintain pressure. When you're at rest, they can dilate, allowing pressure to fall. Now here's where the timing becomes critical. Nitric oxide production follows a rhythm. It is influenced by your circadian clock, the internal timekeeper that governs sleep and wakefulness, hormone release, and countless other physiological processes. During the day, when you're active, your body produces nitric oxide in response to physical activity, to the sheer force of blood flow against the vessel walls, to the demands of your muscles and organs. But at night, something shifts. Your body relies more heavily on signals from the parasympathetic nervous system to maintain that nitric oxide production, to keep those blood vessels in a relaxed state, to allow that all-important nocturnal dip. This is where the nervous system comes back into the picture. The parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest branch, communicates with the endothelium through a specific neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. When your parasympathetic system is active, it releases acetylcholine, which then signals the endothelial cells to produce nitric oxide. It's a chain of communication, a conversation between your brain and your blood vessels that happens without you ever being aware of it. But here's the problem that Richard and so many others were facing. That conversation can be disrupted. Stress, poor sleep quality, certain medications, even the natural aging process itself can dampen the parasympathetic signal. When that happens, the endothelial cells don't get the message. They don't produce as much nitric oxide at night. And without that nitric oxide, the blood vessels don't fully relax. They remain more constricted than they should be, and blood pressure stays elevated through the night. Now we can begin to understand what that simple evening drink was doing. Richard wasn't taking a medication that forced his blood vessels to dilate. He was giving his body the raw materials it needed to support its own natural mechanism. The drink I suggested to him contained compounds that are known to support nitric oxide production, not by directly introducing nitric oxide into the bloodstream, but by providing the precursors, the building blocks, that the endothelium needs to do its job more effectively. But here's where the real insight lies. The timing mattered just as much as the substance itself. When Richard consumed this drink about an hour before bed, he was introducing those compounds at the moment when his body was naturally beginning to transition from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance. He was giving his endothelium the support it needed precisely when the demand for nitric oxide was about to rise. He was aligning his habit with his body's rhythm. Let me give you a more specific picture of what's happening here. One of the key compounds found in this particular beverage is a class of molecules called dietary nitrates. Now, I know the word nitrate can sound alarming. We've been told for years to be careful about nitrates in processed meats, and that's valid. But dietary nitrates from plant sources are a different story. When you consume them, your body converts them into nitrites through a process that involves the bacteria in your mouth, and then further converts those nitrites into nitric oxide in your stomach and bloodstream. This is a natural pathway, one that has been used by human bodies for as long as we have been eating plants. What makes this particularly relevant for nighttime blood pressure is that this conversion pathway is not constant. It has its own rhythm, influenced by things like stomach acidity, the composition of your oral microbiome, and yes, the time of day. Consuming dietary nitrates in the evening allows the conversion process to unfold over the hours, when your body is naturally shifting toward rest, providing a sustained source of nitric oxide support precisely when your parasympathetic system is trying to signal relaxation to the blood vessels. But nitrates are only part of the story. The drink I recommended to Richard also contained compounds that influence the autonomic nervous system more directly. Certain natural substances have been shown to have what we call mild sedative or calming properties, not in the way that a sleeping pill would work, but by gently enhancing the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. They help quiet the sympathetic tone, the fight or flight activation that can persist into the night, especially in people whose lives have been marked by chronic stress. When you combine these two effects, something interesting happens. You're supporting nitric oxide production at the level of the blood vessel itself, and you're also supporting the nervous system signal that tells those blood vessels to relax. It's a dual mechanism, one that works with the body's natural rhythms rather than trying to override them. Now, I want to pause here because I know that for some of you, this might still feel abstract. So let me bring it back to a concrete example. Think about what happens when you're stressed during the day. Your heart rate increases, your blood vessels constrict, your blood pressure rises. That's the sympathetic nervous system doing its job. Now think about what it takes to reverse that state. It's not usually an instant switch. It takes time for the parasympathetic system to reassert itself. And for many people, especially those who have been under stress for years, that transition becomes less efficient. The sympathetic system stays slightly activated even when it shouldn't. And at night, that means the blood vessels don't fully relax. What a well-timed evening drink can do is provide a gentle nudge, a signal that helps the parasympathetic system gain the upper hand. It's not a forceful intervention, it's more like creating the right conditions for something that should happen naturally to actually occur. This is also why the specific drink I recommended to Richard is something that has been studied in the medical literature. There have been clinical trials looking at the effects of this beverage on blood pressure, and interestingly, some of those trials have shown that the benefit is most pronounced at night. Participants who consumed it in the evening showed a greater reduction in nocturnal blood pressure compared to those who consumed the same amount during the day. And this makes perfect sense when you understand the underlying physiology. The mechanism is not just about what you're consuming, it's about when you're consuming it and what your body is trying to do at that moment. Now, before I go any further, I want to be clear about something. The drink I'm referring to is not a cure. It is not a replacement for blood pressure medication. If you have been prescribed medication for hypertension, nothing I'm saying today should be interpreted as a suggestion to change or stop that medication. That is a conversation you need to have with your own physician. What I'm offering is a way of thinking about the broader picture, a way of understanding that blood pressure management is not just about the pills you take in the morning, but about supporting your body's natural rhythms throughout the entire 24-hour cycle. Richard's experience and the experiences of other patients I've worked with suggest that for some people, this kind of simple, rhythmic support can make a meaningful difference. It can help restore that nocturnal dip that is so critical for cardiovascular recovery. It can help transform a pattern of non-dipping blood pressure into something closer to the natural rhythm that our bodies evolved to follow. But what I've shared so far is just the beginning. Because once you understand this mechanism, once you see how the nervous system, the endothelium, and the timing of habits all interact, a whole new set of insights opens up. There are layers to this story that most people never consider, connections between nighttime blood pressure and other aspects of health that are rarely discussed. And in the next part of our conversation, I want to share with you 3 specific insights, 3 things that most people miss that can deepen your understanding even further and help you make more informed choices about your own evening routine. Now that we've walked through the physiology together, now that we understand how the nervous system and the blood vessels communicate during sleep, I want to share with you 3 insights that most people never encounter. These are the layers beneath the surface, the connections that don't make it into the quick conversations at the doctor's office, but that have real implications for how we think about blood pressure, especially as we age. I call them insights because they're not just facts to memorize. They're shifts in perspective. And when you hold them together, they form a more complete picture of what it means to support your cardiovascular health through the night. Let me start with the first insight, and it's one that often surprises people. The first insight is that the bacteria in your mouth play a direct role in your nighttime blood pressure. I know that might sound strange at first. What do oral bacteria have to do with blood vessels? But remember the pathway I described earlier? The one where dietary nitrates are converted into nitrites and then into nitric oxide? That first step, the conversion of nitrates to nitrites, does not happen in your stomach. It doesn't happen in your bloodstream. It happens in your mouth, on the surface of your tongue, performed by specific species of bacteria that live there. These bacteria are not harmful. In fact, they are essential partners in this process. They take the nitrates that you consume from plant foods and convert them into nitrites. You then swallow those nitrites, and in the acidic environment of your stomach, they are further converted into nitric oxide, the molecule that tells your blood vessels to relax. Here's what most people don't know. If you use antiseptic mouthwash regularly, especially in the evening, you may be disrupting this pathway. Studies have shown that using antibacterial mouthwash can reduce the oral bacteria that perform this conversion, and as a result, can lower the amount of nitric oxide your body is able to produce. In some studies, this effect was significant enough to raise blood pressure, particularly at night. This doesn't mean you should never use mouthwash, but it does mean that if you're someone who is carefully managing your blood pressure, especially if you're focusing on evening habits to support that nocturnal dip, it's worth being thoughtful about what you do in the hour or 2 before bed. The same bacteria that some products are designed to eliminate are the very ones that help your body produce the nitric oxide your blood vessels need at night. This insight connects to something broader. It reminds us that our bodies are not isolated machines. They are ecosystems, and the choices we make, even something as simple as what we use to rinse our mouths, can have ripple effects that reach all the way to our cardiovascular system. Now let me move to the second insight, and this one has to do with the relationship between sleep architecture and blood pressure. When we talk about the nocturnal dip, it's easy to imagine that simply being asleep is enough. That once you close your eyes, the body automatically shifts into rest mode. But sleep is not a single state. It is composed of cycles, moving between light sleep, deep sleep, and REM sleep, each with its own pattern of brain activity, heart rate, and nervous system function. The deepest stage of sleep, sometimes called slow wave sleep, is when the parasympathetic nervous system is most dominant. This is when heart rate slows to its lowest point, when blood pressure reaches its nadir, when the body performs its most profound restoration. This is the peak of the nocturnal dip. But here's the insight that many people miss. The quality of your sleep, not just the quantity, determines how much time you spend in that deep, restorative stage. And there are factors in the evening that can either support or disrupt that deep sleep. Caffeine consumed too late in the day, alcohol even in moderate amounts, screen exposure that suppresses melatonin, all of these can reduce the amount of deep sleep you get, even if you spend a full 8 hours in bed. When deep sleep is fragmented or shortened, the parasympathetic signal is weaker. The blood vessels don't get as clear or as sustained a message to relax, and the nocturnal dip becomes blunted. This is why two people can have the same bedtime and the same wake time, but one wakes up feeling restored while the other wakes up with that dull headache, that sense of heaviness that Richard described. What this means is that supporting your blood pressure at night is not just about what you consume. It's about creating the conditions for deep, uninterrupted sleep. And that includes being mindful of anything in the evening that might disturb the architecture of your sleep. The drink we've been discussing, when chosen thoughtfully, can actually support sleep quality as well, because the same compounds that support parasympathetic activity and nitric oxide production can also help quiet the mind and ease the transition into deep sleep. But there's a nuance here that matters. Not every relaxing beverage is equal. Some herbal teas, for example, are marketed for relaxation, but contain compounds that can actually increase heart rate in certain individuals, or that interact with medications in ways that are not always obvious. This is why I always tell patients that when you're considering adding something to your evening routine, you should think of it not as a casual choice, but as a deliberate one. Understand what it does in your body. Understand whether it aligns with your specific needs. Now let me share the third insight, and this one I think is the most subtle, but perhaps the most important. The third insight is that consistency matters more than intensity. When Richard first started incorporating that evening drink into his routine, he didn't see dramatic changes overnight. The headaches didn't vanish immediately. The ambulatory monitoring after 8 weeks showed improvement, but it was a gradual improvement. And this is a pattern I've seen consistently. The body's rhythms, the circadian clocks that govern our blood pressure, our sleep, our hormone release, they respond best to consistent, predictable cues. Think of it this way. Your body has an internal timekeeper, a master clock in the brain that synchronizes countless processes throughout the body. That master clock looks for regularity. It looks for patterns. When you do something at the same time each evening, you're giving that clock a reliable signal. Over time, it begins to anticipate that signal. It begins to prepare the body for what's coming. The parasympathetic system starts to engage more readily. The endothelium becomes more responsive. The nocturnal dip becomes more reliable. This is the opposite of the all-or-nothing approach that many people take. It's not about finding the perfect drink and expecting it to solve everything in a week. It's about finding something that works for your body, that fits into your life, and then doing it consistently, night after night, so that your body learns to expect it and respond to it. And here's where this insight becomes practical. If you decide to try something new in your evening routine, give it time. Give it weeks, not days. Pay attention not just to the numbers on your blood pressure monitor, but to how you feel when you wake up. Are the morning headaches easing? Is the sluggishness lifting? These subjective changes are often the first signs that your body is beginning to restore that natural rhythm. The other implication of this insight is that the drink itself doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, simplicity is often better. The beverage I recommended to Richard is something that is widely available, something that has been consumed by humans for centuries, something that contains the compounds we've been discussing in their natural, balanced form. It's not a supplement, it's not an extract, it's a whole food, consumed in a way that allows the body to use it as intended. But I want to be careful here. I'm not going to name a single brand or a single product, because that's not the point. The point is the principle. The point is understanding that certain natural compounds, consumed at the right time, can support the body's own mechanisms for nighttime blood pressure regulation, and different people may respond better to different sources of those compounds. Some may find that a particular beverage works well for them. Others may need to explore different options. The key is to approach it with curiosity, with consistency, and with an understanding of the underlying physiology. What I've shared in these 3 insights, the role of oral bacteria, the importance of sleep architecture, the power of consistency, they all point to a larger truth. Blood pressure management is not a single problem to be solved with a single solution. It is a system to be understood. And when you understand the system, you can make choices that support it in multiple ways at once. You can choose an evening beverage that supports nitric oxide production, while also being mindful of your mouthwash, while also protecting your deep sleep, while also building a consistent routine that your body can anticipate and trust. These are the layers that most people never see. They're the difference between simply following advice and truly understanding what's happening in your body. And they're what allow you to have more informed conversations with your own physician, to make choices that feel aligned with your own needs, and to approach your health not as a series of problems to be fixed, but as a rhythm to be understood and supported. Now, as we bring this conversation toward its close, I want to take a moment to reflect on what all of this means. Not just in terms of blood pressure numbers, but in terms of how we think about health, how we think about aging, and how we think about the quiet, often overlooked moments in our day that hold more power than we realize. Because that reflection, that calm perspective, is where the real value lies. And that's what I want to leave you with. Let's take a breath together. We've covered a lot of ground, and I want to give you a moment to let it settle. Because the story we've followed, from Richard's frustration to the quiet workings of the endothelium, from the bacteria in your mouth to the architecture of your sleep, is not just a collection of medical facts. It's a different way of seeing. And that shift in perspective, more than any single tip or recommendation, is what I hope stays with you. We began with a question. What if one of the most important things you could do for your blood pressure happened not in the morning, not in the doctor's office, but in the quiet hour before sleep? And I think by now, you can see why that question matters. It matters because the body doesn't operate on the schedule of our daily lives. It operates on a rhythm that is older than medicine, older than modern habits, older than the stressors that so often dominate our waking hours. And when we learn to see that rhythm, when we learn to work with it rather than against it, we open a door that was always there, but that we may have been walking past without noticing. I want to reflect for a moment on what makes this approach different. Because in the world of health information, especially online, there is a constant pressure toward urgency. Do this now. Try this new thing. Fix this problem immediately. And while there is a place for timely intervention, especially in acute medical situations, the kind of health we're talking about today, the kind that supports longevity and well-being over decades, is not built on urgency. It's built on understanding. It's built on small, consistent choices that align with how your body actually works. The drink we've been discussing is a perfect example of this. It's not a miracle, it's not a cure, it's a simple beverage, one that contains compounds that have been part of the human diet for thousands of years. What makes it powerful is not some secret ingredient. What makes it powerful is the timing, the context, the understanding of what your body is trying to do at night, and how you can gently support that process. When you consume it in the evening, you're not forcing your blood vessels to relax. You're giving your body the raw materials it needs to follow its own natural instruction. You're supporting the parasympathetic nervous system. You're working with the rhythm. And this, I think, is a much more sustainable way to think about health. Not as a series of battles to be won, not as a constant effort to force your body into compliance, but as a partnership. Your body has built-in mechanisms for repair, for restoration, for balance. Those mechanisms evolved over millions of years. They are sophisticated, resilient, and remarkably effective when we give them what they need. Our job, in many ways, is simply to get out of our own way, to stop doing the things that disrupt those mechanisms, and to start doing the small, consistent things that support them. Now, I want to be realistic with you. Not everyone will see the same results. Blood pressure is influenced by so many factors: genetics, age, other health conditions, the medications you may already be taking, and that's okay. The goal here is not to promise a specific outcome. The goal is to offer a way of thinking that can help you have better conversations with your own doctor, that can help you notice patterns in your own body, that can help you make informed choices about your evening routine. If you are currently taking medication for high blood pressure, I want to say this clearly. Do not change anything without talking to your physician. What I'm sharing today is not a replacement for medical treatment. It's a complementary perspective, one that your doctor may find valuable in helping you fine-tune your overall approach. Many physicians, especially those who specialize in cardiology and hypertension, are increasingly aware of the importance of nighttime blood pressure patterns. Bringing this awareness into your next visit can open a conversation that might otherwise never happen. I also want to acknowledge something that I think is important. For many of you, the idea of adding one more thing to your evening routine might feel overwhelming. Life is busy. Even in retirement, there are responsibilities, family, the never-ending list of things to manage. And I understand that. So let me offer this not as another task, but as an invitation. An invitation to pay attention. An invitation to notice what your evening routine looks like right now, without judgment. An invitation to consider whether there's a small change you might make, not because you have to, but because you're curious about what might happen. Perhaps that change is a specific beverage. Perhaps it's being more mindful about what you do in the hour before bed, whether that means dimming the lights a little earlier, putting the screens away, giving yourself permission to slow down. Perhaps it's simply becoming more aware of the rhythm, of the fact that your body is trying to do something important while you sleep, and that you have the power to support it. What I've learned over years of practicing cardiology is that the people who do best, the ones who maintain their health and vitality into their 70s, 80s, and beyond, are not the ones who follow every new health trend. They're the ones who develop a deep, practical understanding of their own bodies. They learn what works for them. They build habits that are sustainable, not because they require immense willpower, but because they feel right. They align with how their body wants to function. That's what I want for you. Not a list of rules to follow, but a sense of clarity. The clarity that comes from understanding why the timing of your evening habits matters. The clarity that comes from knowing that your blood vessels are not static pipes, but living tissues that respond to nitric oxide, to parasympathetic signals, to the quiet rhythms of the night. The clarity that comes from recognizing that you have more influence over your health than you might have realized, not through force, but through alignment. So as we close, I want to leave you with this. Tonight, when you settle into the quiet hour before sleep, take a moment. Notice what you're doing. Notice how you feel. And consider whether there's one small shift, one gentle addition, that might support your body in the work it's trying to do while you rest. Not because you have to get it perfect, not because one drink will solve everything, but because each small choice, made consistently, is a way of telling your body that you're paying attention, that you're on its side, that you understand, even a little more than you did before, the beautiful complexity of what happens when you close your eyes. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm Dr. Nargis, and this is HealthWise. If this conversation resonated with you, I hope you'll join me again as we continue to explore the hidden rhythms of health, the small choices that make a big difference, and the calm, thoughtful path to aging well. Until next time, take care of yourself, not with urgency, but with awareness. Not with fear, but with understanding. And remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do happens in the quiet moments, when you're not trying to fix anything at all, but simply giving your body what it needs to do what it already knows how to do.